Pawns generally create the structure of a chess game, and it can be hard to know when to start pushing them forward and using them as attacking pieces in their own right. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 examples of when pawns can be used as sort of the hero of the story and how to recognize when that might be the case in your own games. Before we start finding brilliant pawn moves on the board, I have to tell you about Brilliant.org. Brilliant is the best way to learn things like math, computer science, and data science interactively. 40% of people eat spiders in their sleep? What the heck? This is 40. Check. Alright, I got it. 40% of people eat spiders in their sleep, apparently. They have thousands of lessons that cover basic to advanced topics. A fraction bar can be as effective as a pie chart. Well, I like pie charts better personally, because they remind me of pie, which is nice to eat. It's all super customizable and lets you work at your own pace. 40% of people. Wait, but there's 5. What? Is it this? Alright. You can try Brilliant for free for 30 days at brilliant.org/Kamryn. The first 200 signups will get 20% off their annual premium subscription. That's brilliant.org/Kamryn. Thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. Alright, here's our first example. All 3 of these today are from some Blitz games I played recently, and the computer for this position only gives a slight edge to white, but in the game, I felt very scared about my prospects because these 2 rooks on the 7th, they're often called pigs on the 7th because together they can work to eat up a lot of things on this rank and at the very least, force some sort of perpetual check things. And at worst, they can even threaten lots of checkmating ideas. But I knew my one asset in this position was this pawn on c3. It's very close to promotion. It's a passed pawn, and I've already got 2 strong rooks lined up behind it to help in that promotion. But at the moment, this bishop is standing in front of the pawn, and so in order to threaten to remove that bishop, I played the move rook d5. My opponent saw the threat of coming up here and giving the check, winning the bishop, and so to sort of prevent that entirely, they just moved the king to prevent the check in the first place. I played rook d2 anyway, still threatening the bishop. My opponent moved the bishop. A better move here probably would have been to just counterattack the knight and get rid of the defender of this f7 square where the rooks can then start giving checks, and at the very least, it's going to be a perpetual. But in the game after bishop g6, I was then able to start pushing that passed pawn. It's very important when you have these little pawns that could to push them as soon as it's safe and really create this threat that your opponent's going to have to deal with. Now, there are a couple of ways for white to defend here. Probably the best would have just been to move this a rook into c7, just getting behind the pawn. That's usually the best place for these rooks when you're trying to defend against a very advanced passed pawn from promoting. But keeping in mind, both me and my opponent were down to just seconds at this point. My opponent temporarily forgot about the threat of promotion and allowed it, and then of course once I have a queen on the board, it just becomes a lot easier. So especially in positions where you're getting a little bit nervous about what your opponent might be threatening against your king, a lot of times the best way to make counter threats is to find your assets in the position, and in this case, our asset was this passed pawn. And that's sort of something you can add to the checklist. Okay, do I have a passer that I can potentially push and make a threat that my opponent just can't ignore? Now here's our next example, and I will say in this case, there is sort of a common theme in positions where kings are castled on opposite sides of the board, that a pawn storm is most likely going to be the way that you will be attacking your opponent and that your opponent will be trying to attack you. And a pawn storm simply means that you are throwing your pawns as quickly as possible towards your opponent's castled king. Now this doesn't always work. You really have to be careful and calculate that you're not just putting your pawns where after a series of captures you're going to be losing your pawns. But in a lot of cases like this, where your opponent is placing their pieces in some interesting positions on the board, the pawn storm is actually going to work out quite nicely. So this is also a very clear example of why putting your pieces on the side of the board, knights on the rim are grim or dim, whatever the version of the saying you've heard. And usually if you fianchettoed this bishop and put it on g7 or b7 or the corresponding squares on white side, you usually aren't going to want to move it from that strong diagonal. That's the whole point of putting your bishop here, is because eventually, once the pawn bridge or fence breaks down, that bishop is just going to be a monster on the longest diagonal on the board. And so moving it to the side is usually a little bit counterproductive. And in this case, a pawn storm immediately will threaten to win material and eventually just will force us to win material. We can push g4, attacking the knight, forcing the knight back. If the knight moves back here, we're trapping the bishop. And if, like in the game, the knight goes to the more, common square, we have this fork here. So even if my opponent hadn't made these dubious moves, I probably would have still opted to go for the pawn storm. You can see I was already planning that with the h-pawn push. Because this pawn, when it's pushed forward to fianchetto a bishop, it's often like just a really juicy square that you want to get the h-pawn down there as soon as possible and just break open the defenses around the king. And often your opponent just won't be fast enough to launch a similar attack on the other side of the board. And I said earlier not to just push pawns mindlessly so you don't lose your pawns, but sometimes it can even be good to sacrifice a pawn just to open up the lines against your opponent's king, because you can quickly swing your other rook in here or here and just get these nice long lines of sight. All of your pieces, pretty much except this bishop, are aimed over at the king side, and all of black's pieces are over here just waiting to get pushed around. And now on to our final position. This is one of my favorite examples of just complete domination by pawns. And so already black has made the mistake of bringing this bishop here, overloading this pawn. The pawn on d6 is protecting both this pawn and the bishop now. So if we take the bishop, which I did in the game, the pawn has to take back, and now we're winning this pawn because it's not protected by anything. So okay, knight takes, we're up a pawn, the queen comes down to attack the knight, move the knight back, and black defends the pawn that was now sort of hanging, not really. And now remember, in the first example, I had my rooks lined up behind my passed pawns, and so that's usually a good rule of thumb. I moved my e-rook into d1, and now just looking at this position as it is, it's very aesthetically pleasing, just the beautiful line of pawns right there, but we can't leave them like that forever, right? They're doing a nice job right now of sort of restricting this knight, but lining up the rooks behind them is sort of signaling our intentions and the good intentions that we do have of pushing forward these two pawns and eventually hoping to force our opponent to sacrifice some material just to prevent our pawns from promoting. So my opponent played a5, I started pushing my passed pawn, pushed d6, and you can see how aggressive the pawns are getting already on the 6th rank. It's attacking the queen, forcing the queen to move, and now c5, forcing the knight to move. These pawns are just kicking the pieces around. And while probably the ultimate plan is just to continue pushing these pawns all the way up and get some pawns to the back rank, it's also important to note the strategic advantage of getting these pawns off the light squares, because that's where the open diagonal is on the king, and so eventually we can even come in and try and give some checks along that white diagonal. But anyway, continuing with the main plan, just trying to march these pawns up the board, black kicked my knight away, so I moved my knight. Black is now also using their pawns as attacking pieces, attacking my queen, and so I moved my queen up. And you can see the parallels between these two groups of pawns, both acting as attacking pieces, but ours are just so much more advanced. We only have 2 squares to go before promotion. Black doesn't even have a passed pawn. Like, our pawn is just going to take here, and so these pawns just simply are not as powerful as our passers over here. And now black trying to break down the pawn chain. We don't have to take. In fact, we probably don't want to take this pawn because it's isolating our d pawn, which is probably going to be the one that we want to keep pushing since it is the most advanced pawn that we have. So instead I defended, and now whichever way black decides to take, we do have a pawn that can recapture. Black took on b4, I recaptured, and then, okay, rook a4, it's blitz, these kind of things happen to the best of us. So I took, black recaptured, and now continuing to push the pawns. Notice how these rooks are just monsters right behind these pawns. This is just like a perfect scenario where each rook is defending a pawn, and they're just absolutely unstoppable at this point. Black captured my loose pawn on b4, but it's just not fast enough. Continuing to push the pawns, attacking the knight moves, and now we have 2 pawns on the 7th rank threatening promotion, and black resigned here just knowing that eventually with this, captures, we're getting another queen here. So just to touch again on the intuition side of this, in all the examples, it was the point where our pawns were close enough to our opponent's pieces that they could start kicking them back, and that's usually where it's time to start pushing your pawns. As long as you're not just pushing them off into the middle of nowhere with nothing defending them. In this case, of course, we had a very nice pawn chain that we could follow it up and build as we went. But it's about looking for your opponent's badly placed pieces, seeing if an aggressive pawn push can maybe kick them around, looking for your own passed pawns and using that as an asset. The little pawn that could, right? This pawn has nothing in its way, no pawns anyway, on the files beside it, and that's what makes it a passed pawn. And so noticing when you have that is really important in figuring out good plans to move forward and make the most of that passed pawn as soon as possible before your opponent gets any chance for counterplay. I hope this video helped you understand a little better how to use your pawns as attacking pieces. Let me know in the comments if you have any other video ideas for me. I will gladly take them. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you soon.